4,000 recycled buckets and reacher illuminated, so you have to stay night or come back to any other events because it's more impressive at night. In 2021, we held a great seminar on water global challenges, which is very well attended together with the IDB, the World Bank, and supported by our Agency for Investment Promotion. If you want to know about the findings of this event, we have all you need, so please come to us and we'll give you that information. But coming up, we still have some events. On June 18, we're involved in By the People Festival, which is an initiative of Alcyon Arts, a cultural organization of the city, and we're presenting Water on the Walls, which is a project on video art, and we'll show also some short films, some documentaries, very interesting, on the Aral Sea particularly, by Isabel Coixet, which is a very well-known Spanish filmmaker. From June 20 to June 27, we have some workshops of artists, Mexican artists, Spanish artists, American artists, working together on the theme of water and exploring that with stakeholders in the city. I'd like to name the DC Water Treatment Plant, which is an astounding place, and also the Potomac River Keepers, who are going to work with us on that. And we'll present the result of their artistic collaboration. I hope you can come. It's June 27. And in September, we hope to develop some seminars as well on the oceans together with NOAA, the federal agency, and with the Spanish Association of Sciences. And that's enough of propaganda for today. If you want to read our catalog, it's outside, and we have a very interesting article on water by the curator of the series, Blanca de la Torre. So now today. So there'll be two panels, one focused on the US perspective on the subject. The moderator is going to be Lauren Herzer-Rizzi from the Wilson Center. And the second will explore the linkages between Sustainable Development Goal 6, water, and Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality. And the moderator is Susana Samhan from the EFE agency, the Spanish agency, news agency. There'll be no coffee break, but you can grab the coffee and come back. But there'll be an early lunch offered by Taberna de la Lavardero at 11:30, so thanks for that as well. And if you want to stay, tonight we're showing a film called Y también la lluvia va a Iciar Boyain, also, of course, on the theme of water. Thank you very much, and now I'd like to call to the stage for the welcoming remarks Santiago Cabanas, Ambassador of Spain to the United States, and Stavros Lambrinidis, Ambassador of the European Union to the United States. Thank you.
Good morning, buenos días a todos, dear Ambassador Lambrinidis, dear panelists, good morning to all of you, and thank you very much for being with us at this beautiful former residence of the Ambassadors of Spain, which now serves as our cultural center, as Maria Molina, our cultural counselor, has explained. Thank you, Maria, for hosting us here again, and for the wonderful job that you and your team do, including the organization of this event. Thank you. It is really a pleasure and an honor to open this event, which is, as Maria has said, one of the many hosted in this place under this Fair Water program. And I'm sure you have noticed this beautiful work of art that we've put together in the middle of our gardens with the Mexican Cultural Institute, called La Cascada, the Cascade, which, as Maria has explained, is made of these many recycled buckets, and that really tries to show this huge effort, that the hard work that symbolizes this is enormous hard work done mostly by women and girls all over the world, carrying water in buckets for their survival. American anthropologist Lauren Isley once said that if there is magic in this planet, it is contained in water. And certainly it is an inspiring quote. Water is connected to almost everything in the world, from energy and food production to healthy ecosystem, to sustainable development, and thus to peace and stability. And while many of us take for granted access to equitable and affordable water and sanitation is not, by all means, a done deal for all, but rather a constant source of stress for many. Too many people lack access to safely managed water supplies and sanitation facilities. Fair Water, a right for all, aims to put the spotlight on this global challenge. Under the Sustainable Development Goals, we agreed to ensure clean and accessible water for all. In 2010, as you know, the UN General Assembly recognized the human rights to water and sanitation, and Spain was behind that effort, and for many years now has been greatly committed to water-related issues with the support of IFID, our international cooperation agency. Today, our program will be dedicated in part to the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation, as well as the interactions between SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, and SDG 5, gender equality. We will start with a video that explains the work of the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation, the IFID, in a concrete setting, Bolivia. And it will explain how bringing safe drinking water and sanitation to communities not only improves their health, but also their access to education. And you will also see the important role that women play in the process. Then, during the first panel, we will hear about the US perspective. The US is a global and very important actor in the field of water, with its US government Global Water Strategy of 2017, which I'm sure you will hear a lot about today. We're honored to be joined by Sherry Goodman, Senior Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center and former Deputy Under Secretary of Defense for Environmental Security. She has a great expertise on this topic and will help us understand the US perspective on this issue. Thank you very much for being with us today. We're also happy that we have our friends from California, Dr. Gregory Pierce, and from the Midwest, Mr. Sri Vedashalam, are joining us today to talk about the respective challenges to water governance and access to water in different parts of the US. Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us today again. And for many women, especially in developing countries, the water crisis is a personal issue. In most cases, they are responsible for finding this precious resource for their families, which they need for drinking, cooking, hygiene, and sanitation. It has been estimated that women around the world spend a collective 150 million hours daily collecting water. Imagine if those hours could be used to advance their education or in paid labor. A second video will show you all the work behind accessing water in a very eloquent way. To address these issues, Spain has directed its water fund, what we call el Fondo del Agua, to work in a transversal way to tackle gender inequality. A good example of this is the way the fund has addressed issues of water scarcity and governance in Bolivia, both in rural and urban areas, reaching almost 500,000 people, almost 5% of the population. This has been possible through the implication of many experts from Spain and from Bolivia, and we're lucky to have one of them with us today, Dr. Soto, Betty Soto, a medical doctor who has 20 years of experience in the areas of water and sanitation and has also dedicated a great amount of her time to sharing the lessons learned from her work in other countries. Bienvenida, doctora Soto, y muchas gracias por estar con nosotros hoy aquí en Washington. We will also hear from Carlos Garriga about the amazing work that We Are Water Foundation, which belongs to a Spanish global company, Roca, very active in this field. And also important is the work of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is represented here today by Ms. Soledad Garcia Muñoz. Thank you. Thank you again for being with us. I would like finally to thank our partners in this program, which are many. They include stakeholders from academia, policymakers, cultural organizations from the USA, Spain, and the international community. I would like, of course, first of all, to mention in particular the support of the EU. Thank you again, Ambassador. The IDB, the Water and Sanitation Cooperation Fund from the Spanish Agency for International Cooperation that we have mentioned already, and the We Are Water Foundation. And of course, I would like to thank the team that has made this event possible, the team at the embassy, and especially we have here our Deputy Head of Mission, Cristina Fraile. Thank you. Mercedes Garcia, who's worked so hard together with the European Union delegation for organizing this event. Congratulations, Mercedes, for your great work. Muchas gracias, de verdad. And of course, I mentioned it already, Maria and your great team, as always. Muchas gracias, Maria. Chris, I see him at the end of the room. Muchas gracias, Chris, también. All of you, all the team, muchísimas gracias de corazón. And I now turn the floor to my friend and colleague, Ambassador Lambrinidis, who before being the ambassador of the EU here in Washington was the EU Special Representative for Human Rights. So I'm sure he will speak from experience, but also from the bottom of his heart, because he's worked very hard, as his previous position involved advocating for human rights worldwide on behalf of the European Union. Ambassador Lambrinidis is also a former Vice President of the European Parliament, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greece, and he's back in Washington, D.C., where he started his career as a lawyer. We're honored to have you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cabanas. Dear friend Santiago, it's really great to be here. Thank you for the invitation to speak. And I can assure you that the European Union is very proud to stand with Spain in this effort to highlight the right to safe drinking water and sanitation for all, alongside the Inter-American Development Bank, the Spanish International Cooperation Agency, and We Are Water Foundation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here, of course, as well in this stunning house. It's the first time I've seen it. It's fantastic. And let me congratulate you, Spain, the Spanish Embassy, the Spanish Cultural Center, for the sustainability of your water outreach. It's not a one-off event, from what I just heard. It is something that spans, focuses on a month, may move on to September. This is the kind of engagement that we need to have more of in this country. It doesn't take just one drop in this huge Washington bucket to make a difference. It takes a number of them, and you're doing this. So let me salute you for that as well. The European Union has placed, indeed, water and water policy at the center of its foreign policy. In November 18, there were Council conclusions, a decision by all the EU to focus on water diplomacy. And they're predicated on the fact that water is a prerequisite for survival, and it's also a prerequisite for dignity, and is a fundamental basis for resilience both of our societies and of our environment. So all 28 member states intend to enhance European Union diplomatic engagement about water as a tool for peace, for security, for stability, and to firmly condemn, and this is a real danger in today's world, the use of water as a weapon of war. The vast majority of peoples live in countries whose borders are traversed by water. They share it. In the EU, if you take the exception of 2 islands, Cyprus and Malta, every other EU member state shares water with another one. It is remarkably important in today's world, and for stability and for security, to be able to have international diplomacy that focuses on using water for peace and avoiding using it for war. And of course, that implies another commitment that we have to promote transboundary and integrated water management as well as effective water governance. This was in November 18, and then what is coming now in 19 is human rights guidelines on water of the European Union. So in a few days' time, the Council will be adopting, I believe, human rights guidelines. What are those? Those are instructions to all European Union embassies around the world and all European Union member states embassies around the world to promote particular major priorities of human rights of the European Union through very specific actions. So they're not general analyses or goodwill analyses, they are specific guidelines on what to do in which instances to promote human rights, and water is a major one. Why? Because it relates to the fundamental human right to life, probably the first human right, and it goes without saying that the right to safe drinking water is essential for the enjoyment of all human rights as well. Now, why are we focusing? Because access to safe drinking water and sanitation is a major challenge. In fact, in many parts of the world, Ambassador Cabanas mentioned it, 2.1 billion people lack access to drinking water, 2.1 billion people. Unsafe hygiene practices are widespread, and more than 340,000 children under the age of 5 die every year from diseases due to poor sanitation, poor hygiene, or unsafe drinking water. 340,000 children die every year. Why are we focusing? Because indeed, as the ambassador said, women are particularly affected by the lack of access to drinking water. They do have to walk kilometer after kilometer, mile after mile, in order to get it for themselves and their families, part of their chores every day. And it goes without saying that if you have to do that, you cannot go to school that easy, can you? And it goes without saying that if you cannot go to school, you will be relegated permanently to the status of a second-class citizen. That's not okay. Getting water should not be a cause of condemning women and girls to second-class citizenship status. Why women? Because indeed, sanitation issues caused by lack of water or dirty water or polluted water affect them more than anyone else, including their children, including their health, including in cases that you're in school. Do you know how many girls, when they have their periods, actually cannot go to school because in so many parts of the world there's not the fundamental basic ability to take care of that reality? It's ridiculous, and it's a fact, and the European Union will do whatever it can with its member states to stop that. It's not okay. Why are we focusing on this? Because there's a fundamental link between climate change and water, one that we cannot overlook. Floods and droughts are becoming more frequent and damaging to lives, nature and the economy due to climate change, and poor communities who are the most vulnerable to threats of water supply are likely to be worst affected. Impacts on health and food security can trigger displacement of people and political instability. We see it every day. Now, I told you what we're doing. I told you why we're doing it. Let me tell you how we're doing it. We're doing it in the context of the multilateral system, because this is not a European issue, it's a world issue. And indeed, the ambassador mentioned again the 2030 agenda. We fought very hard to ensure that human rights would be an integral part of the agenda for sustainable development, the sustainable development goals. It was not a given. There were countries around the world 3 years ago that were fighting tooth and nail to ensure that women's rights would not be a separate goal, that human rights would not, in fact, run throughout the whole agenda. They wanted to claim that you can have development without looking at human rights. Well, they didn't win that battle. We won it. The world won it, not we, because in fact it is so clear if you look, even cursorily read the Sustainable Development Goals, how the interlinks exist. Goal 6 ensuring availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all by 2030 is the key goal being discussed today as well. In the same way, human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation are strongly interlinked with other human rights. Look, for example, safe drinking water and sanitation as essential for progress on health-related targets, that's SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 3, including reducing child mortality and deaths from unsafe water, and safe sanitation, lack of hygiene-related diseases. Provision of water, sanitation, hygiene in healthcare and childbirth settings is critical for maternal and neonatal health and survival. Other connections, SDG 4. Reducing the time spent on water collection and improving school sanitation is also important for achieving quality education, as the ambassador mentioned and I just did, and effective learning outcomes. And Sustainable Development Goal 5, contributing to achieving gender equality. Now, let me close, dear friends, by emphasizing on what we do specifically. We're stepping up our engagement in water diplomacy. We are united, EU and member states, in our commitment to making the human rights of safe drinking water and sanitation a reality for all. We have a new approach towards our policies on water that tackle growing challenges of climate change and take into account the EU's global commitment, as I said, to the 2030 Agenda. 2, to sustainable development. 3, to the Paris Agreement on climate change. 4, to the European Consensus on Development. 5, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and to the International Covenant on Civil, Political, Cultural Rights. You know, sometimes I always found it frustrating. Thank you very much, by the way, for mentioning my previous life running human rights for the EU, Santiago, because I found it very frustrating. I would go around the world and committed human rights violators would come to me and very often say, you're trying to impose your Western values on us. All you care about is civil, political rights, democracy, all those things. Our people are hungry, our people are starving, our people are dying, and you don't care about those rights. And I used to say, what? Really? If you look at the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, the majority of all the resolutions coming to the Human Rights Council today on economic, social, cultural rights, education, water, poverty, food, are resolutions that are sponsored by European Union member states. We are holding in the front lines the political flag for economic, social, cultural rights. For all those who are trying to discredit a human rights engagement somehow as being culturally biased. Really? Development aid. Europe is about, what, 80% of the world's population? About 20% of the world's economy? It is over 57% of the world's development aid. 8% of the world's population only, 20% of the world's economy only, is 57% of the world's development aid. I am proud, because that aid is what cleans the water and builds the toilets when they don't exist and builds the schools that allow girls and boys to be educated and to get out of a vicious circle of poverty and violence, and builds the hospital that allows those mothers with the clean water to have babies that don't die. I am proud of Spain. I am proud of the European Union. I am grateful for your conference today. The United States is such a strong partner in this work around the world. I am grateful for the United States and its work, and I look forward to identifying even more ways that we can work together on this. Let me close because I see her dressed in her beautiful European Union blue. To also thank Mercedes for this work, and to state that we look very much forward to welcoming you to the EU delegation in a few months' time, heading a section that deals with water and many other things. So it will be a wonderful transition. Mr. Ambassador, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. Thanks.
que llegar un proyecto de agua y saneamiento a las zonas rurales de nuestro municipio, se ha podido educar a la población en salud. Esto ha disminuido las enfermedades en la misma, como la dermatosis, la micosis, la parasitosis. Y ahora somos un municipio cero en malaria, no tenemos malaria. Antes acudían las madres con los niños en episodios de diarrea que terminaban en muerte, hoy no se nos mueren los niños por diarrea.
Antes los niños no venían a clase porque los papás y las mamás los mandaban a tirar agua abajo y ahora la tienen aquí, la tienen de casa en casa. Ya no van hasta allá abajo, sino que ya lo mandan a la escuela y ya vienen bien bañados y todo porque hay agua en la comunidad.
La contaminación de esta quebrada y de ambos lados es lo que más ha destruido esta ciudad.
Y dado la necesidad de tanta enfermedad, tanto mal olor, entonces optamos por hacerle la solicitud a organismos internacionales. En este caso fue la cooperación española la que nos dio esa venia, ese apoyo, y hoy por hoy, pues después de estar con malos olores, hoy estamos con un ambiente cálido, con un ambiente natural, con un ambiente que la población lo ve de una forma muy positiva.
El diálogo y colaboración con España es muy horizontal. Es un socio que no te plantea nuevos paradigmas o nuevos modelos a desarrollar, sino que apuesta a apoyar y consolidar lo que uno está haciendo. Ese es un buen equilibrio del enfoque de cooperación que hemos tenido con España, que no sea circunscrito exclusivamente a lo financiero ligado a la inversión en grandes obras de ingeniería o infraestructura, sino también en incidir en el desarrollo de capacidades locales, en intercambiar en una gestión del conocimiento muy amplia y la posibilidad de un desarrollo institucional que tenga la capacidad de gestionar estas inversiones y también gestionar el conocimiento para lograr este paradigma de sostenibilidad de los servicios.
Ser bombera significa prender y apagar el sistema de la bomba y darle el abastecimiento de agua a la comunidad. El proyecto ha capacitado a mujeres bomberas y ese trabajo lo hacían antes los hombres. Les costó un poquito, pero después se tuvieron que acostumbrar. Nosotros las mujeres hemos sentido que podemos hacer otro tipo de trabajo. Sí, lo administramos bien, somos buenas.
Okay, good morning. I want to begin by thanking our host today for convening this series and for today's discussion in particular. And thank you to the ambassadors for their powerful remarks. I think they really set the stage for a productive and dynamic discussion today. I'm Lauren Reese. I work with the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. We're just down there by the White House. And And hopefully you can look at our website. I'm at the Environmental Change and Security Program, and we do a fair amount on water as well, so we were really pleased to be included today. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, and then we'll get quickly to the discussion. We're going to try to leave the second half of the hour for questions from the audience, so please be thinking about where you'd like them to dive a little bit deeper, expand on different points, or bring in additional points. I'll start with Sherry Goodman. Sherry is a senior fellow with the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and Polar Institute. She was the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, as well as a staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Sherry has founded, led, or advised nearly a dozen research organizations on environmental and energy matters, national security, and public policy. She is a former Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and founder of the CNA Military Advisory Board at CNA, with the Center for Naval Analyses, which produced an important report on the role of water stress and instability in conflict last year, so hopefully she can touch on today. Dr. Gregory Pierce is the Associate Director of Research at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation and a faculty member in the Department of Urban Planning, and a member of the UCLA Global Public Affairs Initiative. As an alumni of UCLA, I'm very happy to see Dr. Gregory here today. Greg engages in environmental planning and policy research, particularly for disadvantaged populations, connecting the subnational, metropolitan, and household scales with a primary focus on drinking water in California. Current and past sponsors of his work include the California Water Board, WaterAid, the Water Foundation, and the World Bank. Dr. Sri Vedachalam, as of this morning, is the Director of Water at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center based here in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was in a similar role at the Northeast Midwest Institute, where he worked with congressional offices on issues such as affordability, aging infrastructure, extreme weather impacts, financing, and non-point source pollution. He works extensively with water utilities and local governments to understand the challenge of providing clean and safe water under thin budgets, which is an important part of today's discussion. So I wonder if we could start with a bit of background. Greg, could you give us a sense of where we are in the U.S. when it comes to recognizing the human right to water?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm particularly pleased to be here because I really started my career focused on WASH and human right to water issues in low and middle income country context, but over the last 7 years have transitioned back primarily to a focus on human right to water implementation in the US and particularly California. I want to focus my brief remarks on sort of 4 points. The first being giving my definition of human right to water, because I think we all might come in with different definitions and conceptions of what that means. The second being the comparison, the similarities between the US and other countries in terms of human right to water gaps. The third being the differences that I think are important when we think about policies and solutions. And the fourth, and really the focus being on what's going on in terms of human right to water implementation in California, which is rather unique in the US context. So first, when I say human right to water, we don't actually use the term fair water much in the US conversations. But when I say human right to water, I'm really using the California definition, which is that water, but I think it's fairly universal when you look at the SDG framework as well, that water be safe and clean or high quality, accessible and affordable for everyone in whatever territory you're talking about. I think there's pretty clear similarities between California or between really anywhere in the US and even the low and middle income country context, in that the biggest gaps in human right to water, sort of the realization of the human right to water, are concentrated in very rural areas, among migrant populations, and among native populations. That's just as true in California as it is in Guatemala or India. And there's also some clear similarities, I would say, between the US framework, the primary US framework, which is still the Safe Drinking Water Act, passed in the 1970s, and the EU Water Directive that was passed more recently, in terms of the framework for ensuring water quality. And really, in the US context, there isn't sort of enabling legislation or programs to ensure the other two dimensions of the human right to water to date. There are some clear differences, though, I would say, really between the US broadly, and when you think about sort of the low and middle income country, or the MDG-SDG framework. In that, there's relatively few. I think there's still about maybe 1 to 3 million people in the US, and I think I recently saw a similar estimate in the EU of pure inaccessibility to any sort of improved water source. But that pure accessibility, proximity to a functioning water source is not a terribly large issue in the US compared to the other dimensions of quality and affordability. And even in terms of quality, although we have many problems, particularly in rural areas, and increasingly we're realizing in urban areas, we don't have the same burden of microbial quality contamination leading to preventable diarrheal disease and thus leading to death that you see still, for several million people globally. That's really not much of a problem in the US context, thankfully. That brings me to California and really the US sort of implementation of the human right to water. The US is, as far as I know, not a signatory to the 2010 UN Declaration on the Human Right to Water. We don't have a human right to water in the US, and California is in fact the only state in the US to have a legislated human right to water. We passed that, the state of California passed that in 2012, largely due to the efforts of advocacy groups that represent communities in the Central Valley of California, where the worst accessibility and water quality issues are. Again, that human right to water states that water must be clean and safe, high quality, accessible and affordable for every resident of California. And since 2015, we've really seen a lot of action, a lot of activity in terms of implementation and policy by state agencies to make the human right to water a reality for Californians. And actually just this week, due to those efforts, sort of the first sustained policy and funding measure passed to subsidize the operations and maintenance costs of small water systems operating in the Central Valley on a permanent, sustainable basis, to allow for those systems to basically comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act, whereas they've been out of compliance for decades and existing funding streams were not available or robust enough to support that access. We at UCLA, and Nick is sitting in the front row here, have been working on the affordable piece for the state of California for 5 years now, trying to develop a statewide program per the legislation of the legislature of California, to develop a statewide program for affordability, essentially, which would be the first of its kind, I think, on a subnational basis in terms of an affordability program to ensure that the cost of water is affordable for all Californians, as well as to design a component that would prevent shutoffs due to non-payment for water service that hopefully will be returned to the legislature this year and funded at a fairly robust level. We're looking at about $500 million a year annually right now. That being said, although there's a lot of activity in California, we still, I would say, have gaps. We haven't yet turned to the issue of sanitation. There's just now beginning to be a conversation around sanitation and hygiene in California and ensuring means to provide that support, particularly to the homeless population, since we have a housing affordability crisis as well in California. And also more of a focus on the accessibility question and the underlying determinants of these gaps in access, looking at the technical, managerial, and financial capacity of water systems, and really trying to consolidate a lot of the small water systems we have into more sort of modernized and efficient management structures that would also ensure the human right to water outcomes we all are working to obtain. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Lauren, and I look forward to the further discussion.
All right, thank you, Greg. Sheree, Greg sort of walked us through the steps that California is taking to realize the human right to water, and he talked about affordability. Can you define affordability for us, and is the definition consistent across countries and across scales?
Thanks, Lauren. First of all, again, thank you for inviting me. Mercedes, thank you for inviting me to this discussion and event. Greg, for recommending me. I'm obviously locally here in DC, but this is an eclectic, set of audience. And before addressing your point, let me say that I don't have a personal definition of affordability, and it's challenging. There is no acceptable standard in the U.S. right now. the US EPA has a certain definition of affordability that is used for determining affordability system-wide. So is a city's water price or a utility's water price affordable? And that's a very, very broad metric. People have used it in all sorts of ways, and they have downscaled it to a household and said that if you, so the EPA definition is they use a 2% threshold or a 2.5% threshold, essentially meaning that your median rates should be 2.5% of the median income of that neighborhood or of that city. And people use that downscaled in a household setting and said, if you spend more than 2% on water systems or water bills and wastewater bills, then it's unaffordable. That disregards the reality in which we live. We have other expenses to pay for, and they all vary across the board. You live in Detroit, you have a certain other cost of living. You live in New York City, and you live in a smaller town. So those differences sort of mask this idea of affordability. And I think California, in their they put out a draft document recently, and they try to again tackle this question of affordability. And they come up with various matrices of what is basic consumption, what should we be thinking of, and based on that can we define, and other researchers have come up with different ways of measuring that incorporate all these different cost of living indices. So how much are you spending on food? What are the competing uses for your water bill? Are you figuring out whether to pay for your water bill or pay for food or electricity or natural gas or any and all other types of utilities that you need? So that is a quite challenging question, just to tackle that particular topic. I also wanted to talk a little bit about this concept, the term that this event and all of the events have been using, the idea of fair water. That's not a term that we have used consistently. I've not heard that in the water discussion, so that is it's interesting in a way, and I just wanted to explore that a little bit. When we think of fair, to my mind, it comes to two individuals having a transaction. You going to a store, trying to buy something, and you think something is worth whatever unit you choose, $5. And the shopkeeper or shop owner thinks that, no, it is billed at, say, $10. And if you are not in the US, if you are in any of the low and middle income countries, there is a lot of haggling that happens. So you decide on a price between $5 and $10. And everybody walks away with that discussion thinking that that was a fair price. Otherwise you just don't buy it. So if you have decided to purchase that turns out to be a fair cost. And sort of extending that analogy to water means that we are assuming that there is some fairness, some concept of fairness. And I think societally we do agree that there are certain concepts of fairness. So there's a certain fair wage, the idea of fair trade. They have some meaning, although that meaning is very, very subjective, which brings us to, looking at the US might have a different value or different idea of what fairness means. If you go to the EU, that might mean something else. So that alone is a very interesting topic. And that also assumes that we're only talking about cost, how much you pay for it. Underlying concepts of quality and workmanship and all those are sort of built in. You assume that the product that you bought has been tested and certified and things like that. And so there's a lot more going around in terms of water where we are not exactly able to maintain that consistency throughout. So I want to just leave there and then open up for discussion later.
Okay, that's a great point. Thank you. Sherry, I have a two-part question for you. So California is the only state to recognize the human right to water. So I want to sort of zoom back out to look at the United States. And if you could touch on how international water stress influences U.S. strategic interests and security. And does this tie into the question of should the U.S. be more embracing of access to water as a human right?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lauren. And first, at the outset, I want to thank Mercedes and Maria for organizing this. Extremely well done. And to both of our ambassadors for their compelling and passionate comments. Clearly, Ambassador Lambrinidis speaks from the heart and directly, and I'd say they both punch above their weight in sort of elevating the discussion of water, human rights, and gender, which I think is a much needed but often underattended to set of discussions in Washington. So it's very good to have that here. Now, as we noted in the U.S. context, water is often not considered a human right except in California, but we also know that California often leads the way in setting the pace for evolving both social norms and environmental standards across the United States. You can just think back to air pollution standards in the 70s, the energy efficiency of the California economy compared to other parts of the U.S., and at the same time reducing its carbon footprint. And now you see where, and its climate efforts, and then you see now where it's going on water. So it's clear that over the last several decades, we've become much more aware of how water stress globally can be a security issue. Now, in the U.S. context, often what might be called in a European context a right is actually thought of as a security issue, without sort of saying whether that's good or bad. But I recently saw some messaging from a member of Congress from Michigan who has Flint adjacent to her district, very concerned about water, okay, for her constituents, her citizens of Michigan, characterizing water and environmental security as a homeland security issue in the United States, okay? That, to me, is actually a variant in U.S. lexicon of expanding the rights dialogue. It's just being done with sort of different framing that resonates with a different set of citizenry, a different set of voters in the United States, but it's also a recognition of the importance of clean water and access for all. So just to make that important connection. So, you know, what we've also become aware of in recent years, and you all, you know, Europeans know this as you've seen increasing instability close to your regions in the Middle East and in Africa, and some of that instability is exacerbated by the lack of access to clean water, where populations can be held vulnerable by terrorists, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and others, and water is weaponized against vulnerable populations. And so it's very important to sort of reduce those risks, and therefore the efforts to provide clean water and more access, and to enable particularly women and girls to have that access. I personally had the privilege a few years ago in Zambia to see how a wind-powered water pump was enabling a local community to grow its crops very close to where the women would otherwise have been sending themselves. They and their children, mostly girls, would have walked miles to get water. Now they just walked, you know, across the length of this building to the water pump, bring it back, and then they can, and the woman, the mother, about probably my age, showing me around the village, said, well, now my daughters can go to school, which I couldn't do. You know, I couldn't get an education, she says to me, but now one of my daughters is going to be a nurse, and one is going to be a flight attendant. Almost with tears in her eyes as she explained how this is transforming her life, her children's lives. And so I see this happening, you know, around in many areas across Africa, Latin America, Asia, but it's all in sort of relatively, the numbers aren't large enough yet. We need to reach many, many, many more people and improve both sanitation and health, and reduce the water stress and instability. We often forget how that is actually fueling instability. We focus sometimes very much on stamping out the forces of of terrorism or the insurgents without recognizing how their ability to hold vulnerable populations hostage through lack of access to water is exacerbating that very situation. So we've been trying to focus attention on that. I think elevating the attention to water in the U.S., both security and water rights dialogue will continue to be an important dimension. So I want to thank Spain and the EU for shining an important light on this.
Great, thank you, Sherry. I think we should open up to questions from the audience. Is there a microphone for the audience, Mercedes?
I have one.
Okay, great. So if you can raise your hand, and then the microphone will come to you, and then if you could stand and give us your name and your affiliation before getting to your question. Thank you very much. Go ahead here.
Hi, thank you for this very important forum. My name is Contessa Bourbon. I'm a journalist. I'd like to ask the panelists, which countries are involved in water dispute that make the people hostage, and how worse is the situation in those countries? Can you specify which countries?
Okay, great. We can take a couple questions if there's another one, or we can go quickly to that one. Okay, one more question here.
We're always talking about women in Africa, for example, carrying water.
Give us your name and your affiliation.
Fernando Batista, I'm formerly World Bank, and currently I represent water companies and new technologies. And the question I'm asking is really about, you hear girls, 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 what are the boys doing?
Okay, two good questions. Okay, so a question about where we're seeing instability over water, and what are the boys doing?
Okay, well, we've seen water weaponized in parts of Syria, in Iraq, around the Lake Chad region in Nigeria, in particular with Boko Haram, and in Chad and Niger. So those are some of the areas. I don't think they're the only areas. I think young boys often carry water. To answer your question, they're carrying water too. But often when it comes to education, boys are prioritized over girls. So when it comes to education, they get the first chance of going to school. And if somebody's got to carry the water, that becomes the young girls.
Greg or Shri, did you want to add to that?
Sure. So on the issue of conflict, I can talk about, I grew up in India, and it shares border with Pakistan and Bangladesh, and they also share the water. And that is a region of conflict in terms of water issues, and there are treaties that get enforced most of the time, but there is always a threat that most likely India would hold up the water behind the dam and not let it go into Bangladesh or Pakistan. Whoever is on the wrong side of their thought process, is threatened that day or that month or that year. So there is water is used as an active way of generating conflict, or at least threatening conflict. And maybe to answer the second question, also from India, there's data from India shows, at least in terms of the division of labor between men and women, boys and girls, 80% of the water responsibility is shared by girls, 20% by boys. So that's a huge disparity within a family. So that contributes to more perverse outcomes for girls rather than boys, but I would say it does affect both of them in some ways. So the ambassador talked about kids carrying water and not going to school. In many parts of India, and certainly in many other countries as well, the families are too poor that they don't have food at home. Schools have lunches provided, and so if they don't go to school, they're also hungry. So that has a biological effect on their body, just lack of water.
I would just also add actually one other angle on the gender conversation in California that's been interesting, and I think it's relevant to the rest of the US Southwest, In the context of extreme drought, which we've experienced in the last few years, and some communities actually running out of water because of extreme drought, at the household level, everyone's being asked to conserve and cut back water quite dramatically. And what some studies that have been done have found is that women and girls are picking up that message and really doing the leadership on conservation and educating the men in their households to conserve and to try to mitigate the pure shortage and pure drought issues we're experiencing. How to credit them or how to devise policy to support that is unclear, but there is actually a gendered dimension to water access in the U.S. that I also wanted to recognize.
Okay, great. And just one quick note on the water and instability. We don't see much conflict between countries because of water. So water can be part of a larger complex sort of conflict between two countries, but more often than not it's a source of cooperation between countries. Where we see conflict over water is as you get to subnational level and more localized conflicts. So I just want to make that point, my speaker chair here. Are there any other questions from the audience? Here, where
Thank you. My name is Susan Reardon. I'm a member of the Women's Foreign Policy Group and retired from Johnson & Johnson. I'm just curious about the designation a human right, and does designating fair water as a human right, what does that mean? Does it entitle you to more budgeting in California, for instance? Or what are some of the practical and perhaps just psychological aspects of using that term?
That's a great question. And then let's go over to the gentleman on the aisle here. Sorry to complicate things for you.
Hi, my name is Jagan Dudala. I'm a rising senior at the George Washington University studying human services and social justice. And my question is, how do you measure success? And is there a standard of comparison that's used internationally across the board to measure the success?
Okay, and was there one more in the back? Okay, we'll take the one right. Take one more and then we'll come back around. Sorry, in the...
Thank you. I'm Dave Herman from the Office of Conservation and Water at the U.S. State Department. So my question is about the way the right to water is implemented in California and what the repercussions are for the state of California, the legal repercussions if water is not provided in the way specified in, I don't know if it's a regulation or a law or what. And then I guess how that would be transferable to other countries that may not have the same, economic status as California or, the same sort of abilities to honor that right.
Okay, those are three great questions. I would maybe pair the first and last question. So looking at what does the right to water mean in practice, and Greg, maybe you can speak to the experience of California, and then tying in the legal repercussions of that, maybe looking at unintended consequences that might arise. And then the second question is, how do you measure success? And so that could be here or abroad.
Yeah, so let me try to tackle the first and the third a bit. In California, I think I would say, why human rights at all, I think was maybe the first question. It certainly when the human right to water was passed in California, the language is very sparse. It literally just says every person should have safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water. It wasn't until 3 years later that really any activity was undertaken by agencies or by regulatory bodies to start to flesh out what the standards were, maybe to the second question at the person level or really the household level around what that would mean, the standards to which agencies would be held. So far, to the legal question, because advocates helped pass the initial legislation and have been working over the last 5 years with the agencies and with particular politicians in the legislature to develop the solutions, and none of them have yet to explicitly fail or die out. There haven't been legal challenges, even though nothing has actually been done until this week, again, in terms of funding being passed to make the human right to water a reality. There have been a lot of plans developed standards developed, but they haven't actually been sort of enforced. There haven't yet been legal challenges, but I would say as some of the more ambitious funding measures and some of the accessibility metrics, the sanitation metrics perhaps are not as easily funded, there will probably be legal challenges in the courts, but we've yet to see what those will be yet. And I think it is an open question, and you know, I'm encouraged by the progress in California, but also somewhat astounded that we have so much difficulty, even though we have, as we love to say, the 5th largest economy in the world. We have tons of resources that it's been so difficult to pass even the first measure, the first funding measure for endemic quality and accessibility issues in rural areas. We haven't yet passed an affordability measure. We haven't gotten to the 3rd and 4th sort of tenets of the human right to water. And it seems people at the end of the day, even though they all recognize the issue, it's unclear how much they're willing to pay, how much people really are willing to cross-subsidize, which needs to happen for this to become a reality, even in very rich contexts like California. That being said, we hope that more evidence and more, the continued efforts of advocates in particular will drive that and change the norms around that.
Sheree, do you want to talk a little bit about the role of the private sector?
Sure. Can I also talk a little bit about the human right? I would put an asterisk around the fact that California is the only state. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania are 2 other states that have a right to water in their constitution, although I don't think it is enforced. So that sort of answers the question, what happens if it's not enforced? There are examples of it not being enforced. And that has largely to do with how our notions around water safety have evolved over time. So just taking the US as an example, broadly the idea was that we had a lot of industrial contamination, pollution for which we needed to have wastewater treatment plants and the Clean Water Act. So a lot of attention was focused on what was coming out of our factories and tailpipes, you know, at the end of some production process. But the drinking water itself was safe. And that drove a lot of the discussion, a lot of activities. I, in fact, recently spoke to a head of an organization that works on the Great Lakes, and his point was, until Flint happened, we did not even think about it. And he is part of the water sector in a prominent organization. His point was, we were only focused on what was happening on the land in our rivers, but not exactly thinking about what is coming into our pipes in our homes. Flint happened, and that sort of opened our eyes, and Flint was obviously not an isolated incident, but it just pointed to a more pervasive problem that we have, you know, industrial pollutants, contaminants in our drinking water supplies, either through our plumbing, through industrial processes, that we've not paid attention to much. And so it's likely that residents of states like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania will use those laws to argue that we do have a right to safe, clean, affordable drinking water, and can we actually enforce that? So just making that point. So maybe we will see those fights happening in the recent future. There's also another front on this issue where residents of Toledo, rather, they passed a law giving Lake Erie personhood rights. So that means that the people who live in Toledo, anybody who is a resident of Toledo, can argue in favor of Lake Erie and bring someone to court saying you are polluting the lake. So these are the kinds of fights that we are waiting to see. I'm excited.
Okay.
I didn't answer your question, but maybe
The private sector?
We'll
Okay, come back to it? Okay,
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm going to share a story about Massachusetts water from my time serving as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. There's a military base on Cape Cod called Massachusetts Military Reservation, and activities there over a number of years had led to contaminants, chlorinated solvents from primarily air activities leaking in the sandy soil into the water supply of 4 surrounding communities. And both the federal EPA and the state EPA pressed and sued the Department of Defense, not only to clean up the contaminants, which we did, but also, and I actually don't remember whether this was connected to any constitutional right Massachusetts asserted on water, but to provide clean water. And so for the first time ever, I directed the Department of Defense to provide water to these surrounding communities, which was somewhat controversial within DOD circles at the time. I remember getting a look from my boss, who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense, like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, their water's contaminated, so we got to give them clean water, at least until we can get our contaminant systems, our treatment systems up and running sufficient to do that. And so that was a big victory for those towns and those communities. And to go back to Susan's question about what does it mean, to say, what does it get you to say water is a human right in a U.S. context? Well, I come back to this framing of why would Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin be calling water and environmental security a homeland security issue in Michigan? And that's because I think in the U.S. context, it will help mobilize support, perhaps access to things like pre-disaster mitigation grants from FEMA or other sources of funding that will help to improve water supply, not only in Flint, but now, we face a comparable water challenge across the United States in a chemical called, often referred to as PFOA or PFAS, widely used in industrial processes at military bases, but elsewhere as well. And so this is a big water issue in the United States today.
Lauren, I think we didn't answer one of the questions.
Right. How do you
so
measure
maybe,
success?
Yeah, one of you.
Who wants to take that one? Are there, in California, do they have metrics for measuring the successful implementation of the?
Right. So, again, the California Human Right to Water really has three indicators. Quality, well, call it safe and clean. Actually, the only thing that people are talking about is safe, and that's really just reflected as compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is a standard that's across U.S. states. It is enforced, but plenty of systems are not fully compliant, and we do have 15% of the U.S. population that is not served by systems that are regulated to be compliant, which is actually something that the SDG framework is missing currently, counting only 1% of the U.S. is not having safe drinking water. It's probably around 10%, but safe, we have that compliance measure. Affordability, as Sri mentioned, and we're working on, it's sort of it's an open question and sort of open season because people have only been using that term relatively recently. I'd say that it's yet to be determined exactly what the metric will be, but it'll certainly include some measure at the household level of household income, probably in reference to the federal poverty level, as well as the cost of water that people are expending for a relatively modest level of consumption. In California, currently we're talking about 6 CCF, which is, I'm not gonna be able to do the conversion to liters right now, but is well below the average level of consumption. And then people would like to include sort of disposable income or how much people are paying for other necessary goods and services as a part of that metric, but it turns out it's almost impossible to measure that at a state level, so it'll probably just be a reflection of whether you're paying, say, 150% or more than 200% of the state average for 6 CCF and you're also low income. That would be the metric by which you would get a subsidy for unaffordable water. And then in accessible water, we do have a metric in California saying that everyone has the right to 55 gallons per capita per day. We don't actually have a way of measuring that, but that is the standard that's been set. It's actually been driven, again, in California, partly on the basis of conservation measures, radical conservation measures we undertook 4 to 5 years ago, but is also feeding into the human right to water indicator. And that's a level of consumption that's well above any international standard for basic water needs. And some people would actually argue it should be lower.
Great, thank you very much. Other questions? Mercedes?
Thank you so much for this very interesting conversation to all of you, and heartful thanks for being here today. I just wanted to ask, in the US, how much of the right to water, there are interlinkages with the rights of indigenous communities? I know in other contexts, indigenous communities often have rights linked to the land in which they live, and of course there's water, or should be water, in that land. Is that something that has been part of the conversation in the US?
That's a great question. Are there other questions that we can take with this round? Over here, a woman in a black coat and I don't know what color that is. Shirt is very pretty.
Good morning. I'm Cecilia Cavero, and I'm currently interning at the Speaker's office in the House of Representatives. Professor Pierce, you mentioned how you're looking to expand your program to the homeless populations in, I'm guessing, urban areas in California, San Francisco, LA area. Which specific programs are you looking to implement that can be easily accessible for people who don't have a place to live and thus probably no water access?
Great question. One more question from the audience? Come up here to the front corner. You're getting your steps in today.
Hi, I'm Alejandra. I'm with the International Committee of the Red Cross, but speaking in personal capacity as a resident of Michigan, like an hour and a half away from Flint. So my question would be, water and access to affordability of doesn't exist in a bubble. It's entangled with all these social, power, historical dynamics. And so I'm just curious to hear some of your reflections on preventative measures, the institutionalization of them, how you ensure that they're actually implemented, and then what your suggestions would be for those who violate them. What does accountability look like?
Okay, three great questions. Greg, do you want to start with the question about the homeless populations?
Sure. I didn't mean to represent that I was personally working on the issue, but the state of California, again, largely on the basis of efforts of advocates, has begun to work on sanitation. And really, again, there is some very small percentage of the population that doesn't have an improved toilet and sewage disposal method along the lines of what you see in the SDG, but the focus has been on the homeless population, given that it's growing. We have several 100,000 homeless people in our major urban areas, and really, but the conversation has really started where the conversation in the international community started 25 years ago, and the conversations around three different potential policies, but those are, I would say, years away from happening, except perhaps the third, but the three different levels of policy. The first is integrating it directly with housing affordability and essentially trying to create massive amounts of funding and construction for housing for the homeless population explicitly at the state level, and or requiring cities to do that, which they're fighting tooth and nail. The second is building standalone toilets in urban areas that are public, which you don't see very many of in Californian cities. I don't think you see many of them in US cities. If anything, they've gone away over the past few decades, and there's plenty of problems with those that have been documented. But that's the second, is building standalone toilets in public areas, or leaving the public facilities we have open overnight, which there hardly ever are now. But the third, and I think the most promising, is just requiring and or getting private businesses to make the existing bathrooms, which are all over the place, accessible. And the idea is, right now, I know some cities are first looking for volunteers, but then they're going to go create ordinances and mandate that the hundreds of thousands of toilets that are all around become accessible, perhaps on a rotating basis, to those who need to use them, instead of being basically a matter of having to pay for something, or of course being an occupant of the building, because the facilities are all there. There's no question about that. So I think that's the most likely first step we'll see.
We had two other questions. One is looking at the rights of indigenous communities and how the right to water plays into that in the U.S., and then also thinking about preventative measures. With the preventative measures, I think you could think of it in terms of governance, but also infrastructure. What types of infrastructure do we need to be developing and implementing that allow for sustainable access to clean and healthy water? Does anybody want to take a stab at either of those? Sherry?
Sherry, do you want?
Well, Mercedes, tribal nations in the United States have certain sovereign rights, and that includes the water on the tribal lands. So they can and do enforce those own rights, separate from the state of which their tribal lands may be adjacent to, there's increasing issues because of growing drought or water availability about access to those rights. Usually they're managed. I'm not personally aware of any direct conflicts on that, but I know there are growing tensions about access to clean water. And this relates to the basic infrastructure issue, I say, as well, because a lot of America's water infrastructure is aging and underfunded, and I'm sure you've all seen that. The various civil engineer and water infrastructure organizations report on a regular basis and grade America's infrastructure, and water sewage infrastructure often receives failing grades in the United States. So that's an area that needs a vast amount of investment and improvement.
Thank you, Sherry. Sharita, do you want to add anything?
In terms of indigenous communities, I have little experience, but not a lot. There are some communities, excuse me. There are some communities in the eastern half of the country, at least, that are in New York and Minnesota that have sovereign rights, and they have their own water systems. I will mention that in general, poor communities have poor quality of water. That's an ironclad rule that exists in the U.S. and most of the world. So, and indigenous communities also happen to be not very wealthy in general. They have their own land, but they're still reliant on the rest of the U.S. for jobs and schooling and all sorts of communal needs. So they are intricately tied, and many of them do end up buying water from neighboring communities. So there's a lot of interaction that happens, but by themselves, I think EPA awards certain grants to tribal communities, specifically earmarked for them, or at least they are eligible to apply for those. But overall, I don't think their water quality is certainly as good as we would like it to be. And that also applies to communities, that you mentioned, like Flint and other places. There are standards that the U.S. EPA sets, and there are standards that states can exceed. They can go beyond those minimum standards. There are certain set of contaminants. So the only way we regulate water quality is we have a set of contaminants that we have identified, and there is a process for that. The EPA goes through a deliberate process of identifying which contaminant is found in drinking water. Is this harmful, and can any kind of regulation, can it bring a meaningful reduction in risk and the consequences? And so you have to meet all those three conditions before a new contaminant is added to this list of regulated contaminants. So for instance, lead, would be one contaminant. It's some kind of industrial chemicals. So you would have to go through a process, and there are many, many chemicals in the world that we use now that are nowhere on that list. PFAS is one of them. It's in the process, but it's just so complex that we don't know how to regulate them. EPA is still struggling. There are advocates from all sides talking about take a deliberative approach, take a fast-track approach, combine them and regulate them as a group of chemicals, do one by one. We need a lot more testing. So there are all these voices that slow down the process, but in the end, the water quality that comes to our homes might be contaminated with those chemicals, and we have no way of actively regulating them unless it happens at the state level, and some states are beginning to do that. And so, outside of those list of chemicals, it's the Wild West.
We've come to the end of our hour, so I'm going to ask the panelists if they have any final words that they weren't able to share earlier that they want to get in before we conclude, and then I'll ask you to help me in thanking them. Any final
I would
thoughts?
just, add to what Sherry said, and maybe to the question I'm not sure we answered. We need to find a way, although try telling politicians this, that there needs to be a lot more funding. The average person, in the US context, I should say, who's moderate higher income needs to pay a lot more for water to subsidize their own systems, crumbling infrastructure, and cross-subsidize those who don't have access. They pay remarkably little on average right now, and because they're used to paying almost nothing, or in some cases nothing, that awareness or that willingness to pay is not there, but we need to get there to handle these issues. And in this context where we have the money generally, there's really no reason we shouldn't be doing this from a human right to water perspective.
Thank you. Shri or Sherry, any final?
I can go ahead. So I would say, just right on this topic of affordability, it's a sort of intriguing, the contradictory idea that we should have higher rates for water, but at the same time it should be lower for people who actually cannot afford them. It's really complex, and I don't know how you actually put it in implementation, but that is where we should be going. There are a lot of new ideas around providing water at a subsidized, so there has to be a lot of cross-subsidization. The 20th percentile population is the one that desperately needs to have that water but cannot afford it, but the rest of the community can pay higher rates because we have artificially deflated our water rates for a long time, and that has built up this, like deferred maintenance that needs to be done in the US.
Great, thank you. Sherry, any final thoughts? Okay, all right, please join me in thanking the panel.
Difícil. La carrera del agua es difícil. Es lo único más difícil que tenemos.
En este momento yo estoy embarazada y hoy no. Mis embarazos siempre han sido complicados y yo no puedo hacer fuerza.
Hello. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. I'm Susana Samhan, journalist of the Spanish news agency, EFE, and I work here in the Washington Bureau. Last week, we received a new guidance from our headquarters in Madrid. From now on, we should avoid writing the term climate change and use instead climate crisis. Why? Because we are already feeling the consequences of global warming. One of the main repercussions is the lack of water in some parts of the world. I come from the south of Spain, from an area called Extremadura, and believe me, I know what is to spend a long summer without a single drop of rainwater. This is an experience that I don't recommend to anyone, although I recommend you to visit Extremadura, and this is not because I'm from there. Fair access to drinking water and sanitation is a priority for Spain, who's investing a lot in this, and among those efforts we have this panel today and other events under the title Fair Water, a Right of All. Fair water in the sense of justice, but also as a series of events around water. Inside a community which is affected by water scarcity, is everyone impacted at the same level? I will just point out that women and girls are responsible for water collection in 8 out of 10 households with water off premises, according to data of UNICEF and the World Health Organization. To know more about this and other issues, we are thrilled to host Carlos Garriga, Project Manager of We Are Water Foundation, an initiative of the Spanish company Roca focused on projects to guarantee access to water and sanitation around the world. Welcome, bienvenido, Carlos. And also we have Betty Soto Terrazas. She has just arrived from Bolivia. She's a doctor specialized in water and sanitation who works with the Inter-American Development Bank and the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation. She has been in charge of developing gender strategies in rural and sustainability projects. I hope you had a nice trip. Espero que hayas tenido un buen viaje, Betty. And we were supposed to be 3 panelists today, but unfortunately, our third panelist, which was Soledad García Muñoz, Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, was not able to be here because of personal reasons. And also we have with us Mercedes, who will help us with the translation. During this conversation, I will speak in most of the time in English, but sometimes I will translate my words into Spanish to make it easier for the conversation and the dialogue more fluid. So first of all, I would like, today I have many questions, and the first one will be, do you think that women are at disadvantage in terms of access to drinking water? And why? We will start with Betty. Betty, I'm going to translate. Betty, ¿crees que las mujeres estamos en desventaja en lo que respecta al acceso al agua potable y por qué? ¿Cuáles serían los motivos?
Bueno, antes de contestar, un gustoso saludo a todos ustedes. Mil disculpas, mi inglés es muy malo, prefiero hacerlo en español. Así que, bueno, contestando a la pregunta, yo creo que sí, con todos los años que trabajo en mi país y tengo la oportunidad de ver otros países, todavía el acceso y control del recurso humano no es como quisiéramos. Tanto empezando desde la decisión de tener un punto de agua o una pileta en la casa, en la mayoría de las poblaciones con las cuales yo tengo la oportunidad de trabajar, todavía no se las consulta.
Betty, let's give time to Mercedes to translate. Because
so Betty is very happy to be with us today, and she's sorry she cannot address us in English, but that's why I'm going to be helping today. The first thing she says about access to water for women specifically is that access to resources in general is more challenging for women, starting with the decision making about where to put your access point for water.
Porque la decisión la toman otros, sea los dirigentes de la misma comunidad, los responsables de demandar un proyecto de agua, o los decisores designan o deciden pensando que es la mejor opción técnica que va a beneficiar a hombres y mujeres por igual.
So that's a challenge because the decision is rarely taken by women, is never taken by women, it's taken by those who run the project or those who own the house. That will most of the time take that decision of where is that access to water going to be on the basis of a technical decision, thinking normally that that's the best possible solution for the community.
Y el otro aspecto que me permito comentar es, una vez que está el sistema de agua potable construido, no siempre la mujer participa en el control del recurso. ¿A qué me refiero? A que donde hay abundante cantidad de agua, no solamente se lo utiliza como agua doméstica, sino los varones dedicados a la agricultura, a la ganadería o al comercio o fabricación de alguna otra cosa, pues ellos toman la decisión y lo hacen, sin pensar que la mujer tiene que volver a ahorrar cierta cantidad de agua para que se utilice en otros usos también.
And the second challenge is that once that water access is provided for, is the use of that water. And many times women need the water for the households and for household use, while men will need them for agricultural production and also for manufacturing and other commercial uses.
Y lo último que me permito comentar es que no siempre estamos contentas con la cantidad de agua, sobre todo en área rural, porque tenemos problemas de cantidad de agua en las fuentes y cada año se hace mucho más permanente o mucho más evidente la disminución del caudal de las fuentes de agua con las cuales disponen. Sobre todo en mi país hay 4 regiones muy marcadas. Una es el área andina, que está arriba de los 3.000 metros sobre el nivel del mar. La región de los llanos, que tiene abundante agua, y en lo andino es muy escaso. Yo vengo de La Paz.
Sorry, Betty, otherwise I forget what you say. The next challenge is, of course, the volume of water, and that in most cases is diminishing. So in Bolivia, for example, where she comes from, there are 3 areas, distinctive ecosystems, and that they also have different access to water. The Andean area, which is above 3,000 meters, I don't know what that is in feet, but very, very high, that's the mountains and has little access to water. And then there's the llanura, the lower part, which has also its own challenges.
Yo decía, vengo de La Paz. Para los que no conocen, está a una altura de 3.727 metros sobre el nivel del mar. Entonces yo hoy también tengo problemas por haber bajado, es como una caída en paracaídas, ¿no?
So Betty comes from La Paz, which is the capital of Bolivia, of course, and is, for those who don't know, it's 3,752 meters, I believe, above the sea level. So that's obviously very high altitude, and today she feels as she had fallen from a plane to be with us.
Entonces decía que también hay otro aspecto que seguimos considerando, es en términos de sostenibilidad, necesitamos que se pague una tarifa para que el servicio pueda ser operado y mantenido a lo largo de su vida proyectada.
So in terms of sustainability, and this connects with the previous conversation, what Betty thinks is that a price needs to be paid for the service of accessing water so that it is sustainable and can be provided in the long term.
Entonces ahí viene la definición de un monto de tarifa para pagarse en todos los ámbitos de mi país. Es una normativa que se debe pagar una tarifa. Pero la tarifa no siempre es concertada con las mujeres, sino viene de decisión tanto de la parte técnica, que consideran los valores que es necesario pagar para operar y mantener, y no siempre se aprueba en la comunidad o la mujer no estaría dispuesta a pagarlo.
So, and that's where the issue of affordability comes in, because that price, again, is set normally on the basis of a technical conversation, which most of the time will not include the communities affected and certainly not the women affected.
Pero pese a todo lo que les comento, en los últimos años vemos que hay un cambio muy interesante que luego les comentaré. Cambios interesantes porque el primer factor que nos está ayudando a que tanto hombres como mujeres participen en la toma de decisión, ubiquen el lugar donde quieren que esté la pileta, es la información, la comunicación y la educación en términos de agua y saneamiento, la educación sanitaria en higiene, los problemas de salud. Nos están abriendo muchas mejores ideas y perspectivas de trabajo.
But there is hope and there is change, and all of that change is brought about by better education in terms of sanitation and in general water issues, which is performed on the ground by people like Betty.
Sí, mucho tiempo pasó para poder trabajar primero con los varones y luego con las mujeres, y estamos en la fase de, después de haber trabajado en forma separada con los mismos contenidos informativos y educativos, para poder ya trabajar en grupos mixtos en la comunidad para tener mejores niveles de decisión y comunicación entre todos.
So this is important. The way this was done was first with the men, and then once that was done, then with the women, with the same content, but its education was separate. And then after a number of, a long time doing this separately, it was possible to bring the two genders together, men and women, into the same room to discuss water issues. And this is how they're doing it now.
Entonces, los problemas persisten, pero no en la dimensión de hace 15, 20 años atrás, cuando empecé a trabajar en el sector de agua y saneamiento. Vemos mejores espacios de participación entre hombres y mujeres, quedando todavía retos. Gracias.
So things are improving, and there's still many challenges, but we are not in the same place we were 15 or 20 years ago when she started doing this work.
Now I would like to turn to Carlos. Carlos, I would like to know what's the social and economic impact of this situation, of this gender inequality when it comes to access to water in local communities and also in countries. Carlos, me gustaría saber cuál es el impacto social y económico de esta desigualdad de género en el acceso al agua potable, tanto en lo que son las comunidades locales como en los países.
While she was answering, I was thinking of my answer to the first question. And I would like to answer, before I answer the other one, with a question for you. How many of you have gone to the bathroom here since you have arrived? Raise hands. Pretty much all of them? All of you, sorry? Well, I've gone 3 or 4 times. Every time that I got a presentation, I drink a lot, so I have to go to the bathroom a lot. And could any of you tell us how was the experience? Yes, you can? I know. Well, I will. Probably nothing different than yours. It was easy. I was asked where was the bathroom, and the bathroom was just 15 meters that way. Clean, no noise, perfect, good smell, everything at the right position. You go there, you can still think of what you're going to say during the presentation. You do what you have to do. You arrive here, and nothing changed. Okay. And how many of you have drink water? Probably so many of you have been drinking water here, right? Okay. Even easier. Please, some water. And someone come with water, or you go there, and that's water. So the consequences of not having this is still of not having to spend a single second of your life thinking about it. It's just the other way around. you cannot think of anything else more than when I'm going to go, when I want to go to the bathroom, or well, where I'm going to get some water, not just for me, because the women are like everywhere, they are not thinking of themselves, but they are always thinking and in charge of the family. So they cannot think of anything else than a place to go to the bathroom or a place to get water to their families, to their community. So imagine what energy you have left if you can spend hours and hours just thinking, going, fighting with all of these things that can happen to you every time you want to go to the bathroom or you want to go to fetch water.
I will come back again to Betty. You work on the ground, so I would like to know what kind of projects are you implementing? Betty, tú trabajas sobre el terreno, me gustaría saber qué tipo de proyectos estáis aplicando ahí en Bolivia. And you have, I think that you have a PowerPoint, no, to show us better. Tienes un PowerPoint, so can we see the PowerPoint, please?
Me voy a ir allá
Yeah.
para no ir en otro ritmo con las presentaciones. Pero contestaré inicialmente la pregunta indicando que, no sé. Gracias. Los proyectos que se trabajan son, bueno, los denominamos integrales.
So the projects in which
que
they
tienen tres componentes. Son agua potable, saneamiento, sea alcantarillado o baños individuales o familiares, y acompañado de una estrategia social que en mi país es una normativa social de aplicación obligatoria, que es la estrategia social denominada desarrollo comunitario.
So the water projects that are applied in Bolivia have always three components. One is water, the other one is sanitation, and the other one is a social strategy that accompanies all of them, so that they're all woven into the same background.
Acá me permito mostrarles, mi país es muy diverso. Estamos por los 11 millones de habitantes, pero tenemos 36 etnias. De las 36 etnias distribuidas en todo el país, predominan los aymaras, los quechuas y los guaraníes. Entonces aprendimos muchísimo el cómo trabajar en este contexto, desde los materiales, el idioma, cultura, porque no todas las mujeres se organizan de la misma manera ni participan de la misma manera.
So Bolivia is a complex country, as you've seen on the screen, 11 million people, but 36 different ethnicities, 36 different tribes. And it's really important to learn how to work with the different communities, because not all communities organize themselves in the same way, not all women participate in the same way in each different community.
A partir del 2006 más o menos hay un cambio de gobierno en mi país, muchos han debido oír hablar de ello. Es una persona que el presidente que lideriza junto con otros gobiernos el que se reconozca como un derecho humano al agua y saneamiento. Pero anterior al reconocimiento planteado por Naciones Unidas, pues ya en el año 2009 en mi país se aprueba una nueva constitución política del Estado plurinacional, en el cual en varios artículos ya se plantea como un derecho humano fundamental el acceso al agua y saneamiento.
So in Bolivia, there was a change in government in 2006, which started putting the focus on this and other social issues, but also in the constitution of Bolivia, the right to life and the access to water as a fundamental right to life was already recognized before it was proclaimed as a human right at the UN, at the international level. So Bolivia has been a pioneer in this field.
A partir de ese año, entonces, todos los esfuerzos en Bolivia están dirigidos a generar una mayor inversión, a avanzar con cobertura de calidad, continuidad y otros indicadores, porque es un reto para Bolivia el lograr cobertura universal al año 2025.
So Bolivia has as an objective to achieve total access to water, universal access to water, by 2025.
Nos adelantamos 5 años a los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible.
Which is 5 years before the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as everybody knows, are for 2030.
Bueno, esperamos lograrlo. Frente a todo ese esfuerzo, entonces, cumplido los 10 años, tanto el gobierno de Bolivia, tanto AECID como BID, pues, deciden llevar adelante un estudio sobre cuánto avanzamos en este esfuerzo en derecho humano al agua. Entonces se empezó el estudio que duró unos 3 años porque fueron muchos aspectos que analizarlos y se empezó qué fue de la parte normativa, las políticas nuevas de implementación para alcanzar estos retos, pero también se vio cómo estaban las estrategias y la planificación en el país para poder lograrlo. También se vio todo lo que significa la planificación y la inversión pública que había pasado en los 10 años. Entonces, en los 10 años se vio que avanzamos en inversión, también en cobertura. La inversión, pues, en mi país tuvo un repunte. Como ustedes ven en el gráfico, esto representa la inversión en millones de dólares a partir del 2006 al 2018.
So Bolivia has already had some experience in trying to make this human right to water, safe drinking water and sanitation a reality, and they have now produced a first progress report of the first 10 years of that experience, looking at different dimensions, the policies and regulations, the strategic planning that has gone into the sector, and public investment. And the first bit of data that you see now is that there's been actually an increased investment, public investment in the sector of water.
El año 2011 se decide avanzar más rápidamente en inversión y cobertura en agua y nace un programa denominado Mi Agua. A ese programa Mi Agua, pues los financiadores mayoritarios son CAF, pero también el gobierno de España y el BID a través de recursos multilaterales de FECASAL colaboran en avanzar con proyectos específicos para ir avanzando y mejorando la cobertura. Avanzamos en cobertura, tenemos buenos niveles de cobertura pero urbanos, no tanto en pequeñas localidades y menos en rural, en agua. Logramos la meta del ODM fijado por Bolivia el 2015, pero no en saneamiento.
So in terms of investment, you've seen the graphic before, most of the investment came from the public finances in Bolivia, but Spain also contributed significantly, as did the Inter-American Development Bank and other multilateral donors. And in terms of accessibility and availability, there's been also progress. There's been less progress in terms of access to sanitation.
Entonces, como ustedes visualizan, también medimos cada uno de los criterios normativos del derecho humano al agua y saneamiento y los criterios comunes. Solamente voy a señalar los que están pintados de color azul, porque son lo que menos logramos avanzar.
So as in California before, we've seen there are some criteria to evaluate progress, and these criteria are the ones you're seeing on the screen: accessibility, availability, quality, affordability, and acceptability. Mrs. Soto is going to speak in particular about the ones you see in blue, because those are the ones where less progress has been made.
Por ejemplo, en los criterios normativos tenemos todavía bajos porcentajes de oferta a la población en calidad de agua potable. Es rechazado el cloro, sobre todo en área rural, en los grupos étnicos que les mencioné, por el olor, el color o el sabor en algunos casos. Entonces se descontinúa el uso del cloro.
So in one particular issue with the quality of water is that the use of chlor, you say chlor in English? Chlorine, thank you, is not accepted by indigenous communities. So many of the indigenous groups that you've seen on the first screen reject the smell of chloride, and they feel it doesn't correspond to what they think is, they identify with safe, clean, and drinking water. So they have to interrupt putting chlorine into the water.
Sí, y en términos de sostenibilidad de los servicios, todavía tenemos varios retos que cumplir. Se construyen obras, se deja capacitado al recurso humano para operar y mantener el servicio, pero no siempre lo logramos porque no hay los recursos administrativos, financieros. El recurso humano migra, rota en sus cargos, entonces no nos es muy fácil sostener los servicios con recurso humano capacitado y con el monto de las tarifas.
And another challenge is sustainability because of a number of issues. One is the sustained effort that in investment in infrastructure that is needed to improve quality of water and sanitation. And the other one is also the mobility of human resources. So people, experts move around, and their presence in the same process and project is not guaranteed.
Pero estos resultados además alertaron al sector para implementar nuevas políticas. Entonces tenemos una política de implementación del derecho humano al agua y saneamiento de manera obligatoria a todos los niveles de gobierno que tiene el país. También hay una política nueva que es para mantener, mejorar la calidad del agua en todo el país.
So these challenges have also been useful in raising the alarm bell among the authorities in particular, and have led to two policies. One is across ministries, across areas of government, to provide safe drinking water and sanitation, and the second?
La política de calidad del agua.
And the second has been the adoption of a policy on water quality, which addresses the first issue that we mentioned before.
En este avance en el país, ¿qué puedo comentarles sobre el enfoque de equidad de género? Hemos avanzado también interesantes aspectos, comprendiendo la importancia de trabajar con hombres y mujeres, tratando de mejorar las oportunidades de información, comunicación y llegar a decisiones en los niveles de organización que existen en las comunidades rurales o pequeñas localidades. Entonces avanzó en la parte normativa primero.
So this leads her to what the remarks he wanted to make on gender approaches, and has also led to some improvements in the way water issues are tackled, including a gender dimension.
Acá puedo comentarles que todas las instituciones conocen, programan trabajar el enfoque de equidad de género como transversal, los financiadores apoyan todas las instituciones, tenemos estrategias, tenemos políticas, está la normativa que ustedes ven, es un reglamento de carácter obligatorio, y el documento amarillo es una parte metodológica que nos ha permitido rescatar todo lo que son los métodos de trabajo operativo con las personas.
So in the previous screen you saw two of the regulations that were adopted, the regulation on the water sector and sanitation, and also a guide of implementation. So there are public policies and public regulations that make it compulsory to have a gender-sensitive approach to water sanitation.
Tuvimos que aprender, todos los que trabajamos en el sector agua y saneamiento, a entender la diferencia de los roles, responsabilidades, condición y posición de la mujer en los diferentes contextos y grupos étnicos que tiene Bolivia. Entender la diferencia entre el cómo ser niño y el cómo ser niña de acuerdo al grupo étnico.
So this has also led to a better understanding by all of the experts like herself who work in the area as to what are the different experiences of boys and girls, not only as boys and girls, but also depending on which community they belong to.
Y los que está remarcado hacia abajo en la positiva es que fueron nuestras reflexiones iniciales. Ahora ya sabemos que hay diferencias. ¿Cómo trabajamos? ¿Cómo integramos a la mujer en cada grupo y en cada ámbito rural, periurbano, urbano y por grupo étnico?
So those, once the differences have been identified, they led to the questions that you have on the screen. So how to tackle those differences in an efficient way.
¿Cómo hacemos que hombres y mujeres ejerzan su derecho y se democraticen los roles al interior del hogar?
So, for example, how to make both women and girls exercise their rights within the household and therefore democratize the dynamics within the household itself.
Y cómo lo más difícil fue lograr que los varones comprendan el por qué hablamos de democratizar los roles en el ámbito doméstico.
And the most difficult task was to make men understand why it was important to talk about democratization of roles within the household.
Y cómo logramos que participen hombres y mujeres sin tener problemas al interior de cada familia. Y la última fue, ya entendimos, pero ¿y ahora cómo capacitamos, cómo informamos, con qué métodos y materiales?
So it was first difficult to make them understand why this was important, but also then how to make it happen, how to do capacity building on the ground with those households, so to make the difference.
Tenemos el apoyo de dos programas de alcance nacional. El programa de agua potable y saneamiento para pequeñas localidades y comunidades rurales, financiado por el BID y FECASAL, y empezamos a probar, a rediseñar los materiales y los mensajes para trabajar en ese tipo de comunidades que ustedes ven en la foto. Esa es una comunidad rural altamente dispersa, que entre las viviendas hay entre 500 metros a 1 kilómetro de distancia.
So they have a couple of programs that help in these activities. One is a program for small towns to bring safe drinking water and sanitation. And these are rural communities where there's a long distance between households, sometimes as much as half a kilometer or a kilometer, which is about half a mile between one household and the next household.
En este programa entonces se convierte en un principio fundamental el trabajar con el enfoque de género para volver todos nuestros esfuerzos que sean visuales y efectivos.
So in these programs it's very important to have a gender-sensitive approach to lead to effective results.
Para ello se definieron algunas líneas de trabajo y también se definió de inicio trabajar con dos tipos de comunidades, unas comunidades control y otras piloto. Las pilotos son denominadas comunidades con enfoque de género intensivo.
So they decide to work with these communities, designating control communities and pilot communities. And the control communities, correct, were the gender equity ones.
La primera línea de trabajo fue trabajar con el enfoque de derechos, tanto para hombres como mujeres, para que cada uno comprenda qué derechos se tiene, derecho, empezando el del derecho de la vida, la salud, al acceso al agua y saneamiento.
So the first thing was to educate these communities in human rights in general. What rights do they have, starting with the right to life, but also including the right to safe drinking water and sanitation.
Y los niveles de participación, que tanto hombres y mujeres pues también tenemos derecho a participar, a opinar, tomar decisiones. La segunda línea fue formar a las mujeres más específicamente en ejercer su liderazgo, a través de trabajar con ellas en la autoestima. Son comunidades muy machistas en su mayoría.
And the second line was to work with women on their own leadership capacities, because these communities are traditionally not very prone to let women exercise leadership.
También trabajamos en capacitar primero a las mujeres para formar parte de la entidad operadora de los servicios de agua y saneamiento. En mi país predominan los comités de agua potable y saneamiento, los CAPIs y las cooperativas. Entonces, primero se capacitó a la mujer antes de llegar a la reunión o a la asamblea para que elijan a sus miembros.
So a big part of this was to train women, as you've seen in the video before, so that they can take part in these discussions in a purposeful way. And the training took place before the assembly, which was going to elect the members of the committee that runs the water systems.
Podemos decir que lo logramos, pero también se nos presentó un reto. En términos de infraestructura, varios ajustes eran necesarios para satisfacer la necesidad de la mujer.
So they achieved this, to give women a role in running the water infrastructure, but they also realized that in doing so, there was some changes needed to the water infrastructure to make it possible for women to be part of it.
Aspectos que no tuvimos en cuenta. Hablando sobre los baños, por ejemplo, ya nos mencionaba, tenemos acceso, tenemos inodoros, pero cuando se puso los inodoros, las mujeres aymaras utilizan unas faldas muy amplias, denominadas polleras. Entonces ellas empezaron a observar que el inodoro estaba muy cerca a la pared y no podían sentarse cómodamente porque les impedía la ropa.
So one of the issues was the toilets in this infrastructure, because Aymara women have a very elaborate dress with many layers to it. So if the toilet is too close to the wall, there's no space for their attire, so they cannot comfortably use the toilet.
Entonces se habló con los ingenieros, se tuvo que ajustar el diseño, tener un poco más espacio al interior del baño, se volvió a colocar en otro lugar los inodoros y se tuvo interesantes cambios, pero también en agua.
So this was resolved by basically talking to the engineers and those who designed the project and making sure that the toilets were in a place that was comfortable for women, for the Aymara women to use them. There were all the challenges.
En agua, pues involucramos a las mujeres. Ahí en la foto de la izquierda, la primera, es la vestimenta de la pollera. Entonces se informó, se capacitó a las mujeres a recorrer todos los componentes de un sistema de agua para comprender cómo era que teníamos agua de mejor calidad en el domicilio denominada potable.
So another challenge was to bring all of the components that are needed to provide safe drinking water and sanitation within the household, and helping women understand that process.
También tuvimos que nosotros aprender a manejar mejor el idioma, mejor las reuniones, generar diferentes espacios de capacitación y de información entre hombres y mujeres para lograrlo. Pero también hay otro proyecto, otro programa que lo financia FECASAL, lo ejecuta AECID, denominado Programa SASPC. En ese programa, pues, seguimos ajustando, además de lo técnico, ajustamos la forma de comunicarnos y capacitar con el uso de diferente material educativo. Volvimos a priorizar lo lúdico y lo participativo.
So another challenge was the language used for this capacitation, to make sure that the messages got across. And part of finding the right language was also this program that you see on the screen, which returned to a more fun way of dealing with these issues of water and gender, and also, again, putting the focus on gender issues.
Para trabajar a través de los dibujos, los roles, responsabilidades de todos los miembros de la familia, de hombres y mujeres. ¿Cómo promovimos la democratización de los roles frente a servicios de agua y saneamiento? Entonces vimos que al dar un baño, en este caso, en este programa, se implementaron los baños ecológicos secos, que requieren muchas más tareas que el inodoro de agua. Entonces se vio que cada actividad, desde el uso, la disposición final de los papeles, la preparación de materiales que utiliza este baño, pues se asignaron tareas a los miembros de la familia a través de estos carteles que cada domicilio tiene.
So one very practical way of making this happen was to this project that you've seen on the screen, which is about installing toilets in the community. And what was done was to assign roles to each member of the family through these pictures you have here. So it was clear who had a task and what task was attributed to each of the members of the family, obviously men and women included.
Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time. This is very interesting, but I want to make sure that also Carlo talks and we have time for questions for our audience. So I would appreciate, Betty, if you finish.
Muy bien, gracias. Solamente, así, ¿no? Como buena latina, ¿no? Es la escalera que logramos construir con los logros que se pudo avanzar en lo que es género. Entonces ustedes ven las gradas, nos quedamos en el 4, porque todavía nos falta trabajar lo que es la posición de la mujer. Logramos la condición, pero aún falta trabajarlo. Gracias.
Gracias. Thank you very much. So just to wrap up, the ladder you've seen is the achievements that they've made, and every level has been attained except the 5th one, the top one, which is a real change in the position of women in the community.
It's also important the contribution of public sector, and here Carlos can tell us a little bit more about his experience at We Are Water Foundation. I believe also that you have a video, so when you are ready, let us know.
Well, I would like to share, it works, some stories. The first one is to show you what is the We Are Water Foundation, what we do, and who we are. If it works, yes. Okay, here we are.
Casablanca, hemos venido a México.
El Bahía es un país seco.
Barcelona de Shanghái, the eastern border of Morocco.
Ghana is a young country.
En el Chaco boliviano.
En la provincia de Loja, Ecuador. Si podemos apoyar en algo, con muchísimo gusto. Estamos comprometidos con el agua, igual que ustedes.
Me parece increíble el trabajo que están haciendo a nivel mundial.
Colaborar con el gobierno central de la India, con Roca y con Water.
En la colaboración de Vía Water, se está consiguiendo todos estos cambios de hábito de las personas. Soy Jorge Arditi y yo soy agua. Soy Arturo Arditi y también soy agua. I'm made of water.
Water.
Agua. I'm water. Soy agua.
I am water.
Y como tú, yo también soy agua.
Soy agua.
El agua somos todos. Le hacen un servicio increíble al trabajo de las Naciones Unidas.
So basically what we do is to bring water and sanitation where it's needed, whatever it takes. But, wait a second. Yep. With these two objectives is to help and to raise awareness. To help, it means to develop projects, to bring water and sanitation, in which manner it's possible. And the other one is to raise awareness, to make the problem visible, to let people know about it. At least so that people cannot say we didn't know it. At least we want to put our job to let people know about this issue. It's not working. Yeah. Can you put the other one, please? And this one again? No, the previous one. Yeah, I'm a photographer as well, so many times I don't know if to talk or if just to show pictures. But I think with this couple of pictures, there's nothing more left to say to understand what's the difference between being woman here or there, right? This is a young girl from Ghana. She was 11-year-old, and as it's been told during the presentations and the other table, she spent a lot of hours just going back and forth to fetch some water. Like all the women that I've seen in all the different countries that I've visited when we go to bring water and sanitation. It doesn't matter where. You can try to find a man bringing a bucket with water and you won't find it. It doesn't exist. So in Ghana, in Ethiopia, in India, in Afghanistan, in a refugees camp, in Ghana again, in Mauritania, in Indonesia. It's like everybody just tried to do the same without even knowing each other. Because why is the reason that a girl in Afghanistan got the same troubles that a girl in Ethiopia, or a girl in Bolivia, or a girl in Brazil? They don't know each other. How is it possible? What happened is that they not only have to go to fetch water, polluted most of the times, and spending hours and hours, taking in account that just in Africa, there are something like 40,000 million hours spent going to fetch water. Most of them, of course, done by women. So imagine how many other things those hours could be invested in. Sometimes they have to go to a river or lake nearby, 6-7 kilometers away from their places to get this polluted water. Some others, they are a bit more lucky and they have a well close to their houses, but then they have to wait a long time because there are so many people queuing to get water. Some others, they have to go to fetch water before going to school. And what is the result of that? The result of that is something like this. This is a picture that I took in Ghana. That was in the north part of Ghana, Santiago. And this was a school. And when we got there, the director of the school told me, do you want to come here? And because we were about to start the project here. I still didn't have water. And when I got into the classroom, and I've seen so many things that I was absolutely shocked about this, what I saw. The explanation of this picture is that all of those children, or most of them, that was around 8:30 in the morning. All of them had to go with their mothers every single day at 3-4 a.m. to fetch water with their mothers, spending a lot of time, and not only spending a lot of time, but spending all the energy they have. So when they got in school, they just cannot stay awake. They are absolutely exhausted. So apart from being late, they cannot attend to what the explanations of the teacher is saying. So it will be possible for these children to become anything more than poor people. And at least the boys have something else in a positive way, that at least they will keep going to the school. But what is going to happen, probably, I'm sure, to the girls is that they will have to drop school because they won't have separate latrines, or they won't have the proper place to the intimacy when they got menstruation. So when they become teenagers, the girls probably will have to drop school. Yep. Well, you can see the difference. This is the same area, but in a place that we had brought water 6 months before. Everything changed. Fuck. Doesn't work, right? Yeah. Well, it's been said quite a few times, 2.4 billion people without sanitation, 2.1 billion people with no water. That's the consequences. Well, some project that we have developed. Since we started, we have helped 1.5 million people. Different projects that we develop. We could summarize in 3: infrastructures, latrines and wells, and emergencies. And I will share with you an example of them.
Mereka itu kalau kita tinggal sama mereka itu, kalau air minum dan tidak diambil, langsung minum air mentah itu. Kalau kena penyakit mancrat, dapat malaria.
El proyecto que hemos desarrollado aquí en Indonesia, en la isla de Sumba, consta de 2 pozos que van a dar agua a más de 5.000 personas. Cada pozo tiene adosado un tanque como este, que mediante energía solar permite llenarlo y transportar todo el agua a estos grifos para que varias personas a la vez puedan llenar sus cubos y llevar a sus casas.
Having access to clean water will eliminate some forms of common diseases. Supaya anak-anaknya kami tetap sehat dan bersih. Menjadi guru, perawat, dokter pun kalau bisa mau ini mereka.
Membantu untuk kita juga ini dari mana?
Bisa kurang membeli air begitu. Dan kita kalau bisa sekarang kan sudah ada air, jadi kita bisa bekerja yang lain, tanam sayur kan bisa kan?
Memberikan bantuan melalui sumber bor ini untuk mendekatkan kami punya kebutuhan. Karena air ini sangat penting bagi kebutuhan kami.
Well, we are running out of time, but in honor of Betty, I would like to share with you another one from Bolivia.
Claro, mi gente casi no conocía más así nadie lo que nos explica nada, ¿no? Los papas antiguamente ellos se han criado así nomás, ellos no conocían estas cosas que ahora estamos conociendo nosotros. Vos nos vienen a explicar cómo hay que hacer comer limpio, algo. Y por eso ahora ya estamos aprendiendo un poco. Entonces los niños están aprendiendo lo que aprenden aquí en la escuela y los técnicos.
Esos niños toman una conciencia importante y son los que también motivan en sus hogares para que estas prácticas se puedan realizar.
En la colaboración de Dios, ¿no? Se está consiguiendo todos estos cambios de hábito de las personas, porque si no fuera esa cooperación, nunca hubiera esos cambios.
Me ha llegado aquí en la escuela que él ha dicho, papá, que tenía el profesor Miguel, me ha llegado así, me ha dicho, profesor, tienen que lavar las manos antes de comer, eso le explico a papá. Papá.
No, enseñan eso, así aprendí en la escuela, ¿no?
Vamos al baño, vamos a hacer la caca, ¿no ves? En el alta las bacterias, por eso hay que lavar las manos para que no tengamos bacterias.
Manos limpias salvan vidas.
Well, nothing else. We can keep.
Okay, I'm afraid. Thank you, gracias, Carlos. I'm afraid that we are already in extra time, but at least I think that we are going to open the floor for the public just for a couple of questions. So if anyone wants to make a question, it's now or never, as we say in Spanish.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful work that you're doing. I'm Rachel Robbins, formerly with the IFC. And my question is, you're reaching a lot of people, but clearly the need is much greater. So do you ever work with the private sector so that you could leverage through blended finance or other structures more private sector funding?
No? Yeah. No. Yes, well, in fact, the Water Foundation was created by the private sector. So Roca, it's a Spanish brand working around the world. But yes, at the same time, we are always collaborating and trying to find new partners in the private sector. We think that public, private, and non-profit, it will be the only, and civil people, it will be the only way to try to fix or to reach the possibility of having water and sanitation for everybody. I think it should be even, I think it's in India. In India, all the companies that are working in India, they have to give 2% of their benefits to non-profits. I think this should be a good example of how governments can push private sector, if the private sector are not doing it itself, to do things for the world, for the community, to return something from the community that are taking some benefits. So the answer is yes, we are doing something with the private sector.
I think there were a couple of gentlemen here.
Petty. Tengo una pregunta de las aguas que tratan en Bolivia, y el agua que están tomando está contaminada con aguas industriales, ¿no?
The question is if the water that they are having in Bolivia, is it polluted with industrial water?
Tenemos, depende de los lugares, porque hay contaminación industrial, por ejemplo, en el alto de la ciudad de La Paz, por el manejo de las curtiembres, ¿no? El tratamiento de las pieles de los animales, sí, tenemos contaminación, pero también hay otro tipo de contaminación en las zonas mineras, en las zonas andinas, por diversos metales y por el tratamiento, que puedo decir, la explotación por el oro, también hay otras zonas. Estos últimos años, dado el auge de la agricultura en los llanos, también se está empezando a presentar la contaminación por los agroquímicos. Entonces, son nuevos retos, y el último que se describió en una zona de Santa Cruz es la contaminación por hierro muy elevada.
So yes, there's been some issues of contamination of water in Bolivia. The first one she mentioned is in the area of La Paz, in the area of the capital. There are some tanneries, so production of leather, and that has always been a contaminator traditionally. There's other areas, especially in the mountains, which are mining areas, which also suffer from contamination from mining, and in particular the exploitation of gold mines. And more recently, a more developed agriculture has also sometimes come with chemical contamination of waters.
We can have one more question, the last one, the lady there.
Hi, I'm Bandu Idris. I'm a senior at University of Maryland and an intern for the Environmental Law Institute. So my question is, in the face of the climate crisis, water is usually like a source for tension and conflict. And in your work, I see that water can be used as a tool for peace building, especially in regards to women. So in what ways do you see women's rights to water being used as a tool for peace building, and how can the international community learn from that?
Sí, ¿cómo se utiliza lo que es el agua para lo que es la construcción y luego lo que es la desigualdad hacia las mujeres a la hora de construir lo que es la paz? O sea, ¿cómo se emplea el agua básicamente en situaciones de conflicto y entiendo que también de violencia, que es uno de los temas que no hemos hablado?
Bueno, en construcción depende del ámbito. En el área periurbana y urbana yo creo que hay más equilibrio que en lo rural, porque la familia en lo rural construye su vivienda. Lógicamente bajo usos y costumbres es ayudada por todos los miembros de una comunidad, entonces diría que es un uso más o menos organizado y respetado entre toda la comunidad y la familia que va a construir. Pero en cambio en áreas periurbanas no. Hay escasez de agua, por tanto el uso en construcción está siendo, puedo decir, sobreexplotado el uso doméstico del agua en construcción en áreas periurbanas y urbanas.
Okay, let's give time to Betty to...
So she's using the example of building and the different circumstances in rural areas and in peripheral areas to cities. In rural areas, a community, an entire community will help build a house, and therefore the roles will be shared, and also the water will be used that is needed in that construction is going to be used in a more equitable way, whereas in areas, in peripheral areas to cities, a lot of new construction to accommodate more people moving in from rural areas to cities create a tension on access to water and therefore create inequities as well.
To wrap up, I would like, do you want to continue? Okay, sorry.
Quería comentar también algo sobre los usos del agua. En área rural hay una competencia. En entre el uso doméstico y el uso en ganadería y producción, dado que los caudales de agua en muchas zonas están disminuyendo. Entonces, pese a que se construyan sistemas de agua cuya prioridad es el uso doméstico, no siempre se obedece porque también afecta a la economía el no utilizar en la ganadería y la agricultura, pese a que las normas dicen lo contrario. En áreas periurbanas,
So another conflict that arises in rural areas is the difference of use for household and the use for agriculture. And the households are typically run by women, and then that's where the conflict stands, and the agriculture is typically run by men. So that's another gender dimension to the conflicts around water.
Y en periurbano quería comentar, pese a tener agua para uso doméstico prioritariamente, pero se está utilizando también en, ¿cómo diría?, en producir microempresas a nivel del hogar. Por ejemplo, la mujer recolecta ropa para lavarlo en su casa con el agua doméstica, con el agua potable, y los varones pues se dedican a lavado de autos, lavado, etcétera, ¿no? O pequeñas construcciones. Entonces, seguimos observando y tratando de que exista un mejor equilibrio en el uso del agua.
And another tension comes from the water that is, in Bolivia, the law is that household use should be prioritized. But sometimes that household use also includes small businesses, like women who wash water in their homes as a business for a price, and men who wash cars also to clean cars for a price. And that is not really household consumption, but it's all put together so that a lot of smaller areas of conflict also arise from the different uses from water.
So as we don't have any more time, I would like to wrap up with the last question to our panelists. Do you think that is it possible to end gender inequality in access to water? Can we have any hope? Mi última pregunta, ya para acabar, sería si es posible acabar con la desigualdad en términos de género en lo que al acceso al agua potable se refiere, si podemos tener esperanza en el futuro.
No, yo creo que sí, pues hay esperanza, ¿no? Es lo último que muere, pero se necesita mucho trabajo, mucho impulso. Lo que les comenté son experiencias focalizadas bajo 2 programas que ha financiado el esfuerzo por mejorar y trabajar en dar la misma oportunidad a hombres y mujeres camino a lograr la igualdad en el acceso y el control del recurso. Pero todavía quedan varias preguntas, ¿no?, y retos a la vez. Hay gente capacitada, ahora tenemos formas de operacionalizar el enfoque de género para lograr lo que les comenté, pero no todos los que trabajamos en el sector están capacitados y lo manejan.
So yes, there's always hope to improve things. The 2 examples that she's shown today are proof that you can actually improve things when you invest in water and safe drinking water and sanitation. There's still a lot to do, of course. Again, the main focus should be on capacity building and expertise, because not all of those that intervene in these processes are actually sufficiently trained for a gender-sensitive approach.
Y el otro reto que nos planteamos es cada cierto periodo hay cambio de gobierno en los países, ¿no? Entonces los niveles decisores, los planificadores, etcétera, que están sensibles y capacitados al género, pues van rotando por estas circunstancias. Entonces es un efecto que estamos pensando cómo mantenerlo. Hay elecciones en mi país este octubre, entonces todo este avance no sabemos cómo queda.
And another challenge, of course, is changes in government, and those sometimes bring a less sensitive approach to gender, and there are elections in Bolivia this year, so this, again, could change for political reasons again.
Yeah. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, Carlos. Can we have some hope in the future is it possible to finish with gender inequality in terms of access to drinking water?
To hear again the final part. To finish with gender inequality in terms of water, right? Okay. Can we finish with gender inequality in any other field of our lives? When we start to treat women as a men, in water, in work, in politics, in CEOs and private sector, public sector, in any other sector, I think we will be closer to finish, to be closer to finish the inequality of gender. But because inequality of gender itself is nothing. It's, when we are talking about the inequality of gender, we are talking about health, about security, about well-being, about work, about dignity. So we cannot think of gender as a man as something away from us. It's something that it touches all of us. So if we convince ourselves that we all have the same rights and the same duties, I think we'll be closer to that.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming, and I hope that you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.